In Lesson 10, we finished making a basic user resource together with a flexible authentication and authorization system. In this lesson and the next, we'll put the finishing touches on this system, starting with an account activation feature that verifies each new user's email address. This will involve creating a new resource, thereby giving us a chance to see further examples of controllers, routing, and database migrations. In the process, we will also learn how to send email in Rails, both in development and in production. In this lesson and the next, we'll put the finishing touches on the core of the sample application by adding two closely related features: account activation, which verifies a new user's email address, and password reset for users who forget their passwords. Each of these two features will involve creating a new resource, which will give us a chance to see further examples of controllers, routing, and database migrations. In the process, we'll also get a chance to learn how to send email in Rails, both in development and in production. Our first subject, account activation, involves starting new users in an inactive state, in contrast to the current design, which gives users full access to their accounts as soon as they sign up. The basic idea for the new design is that when users sign up, they'll get an email with an activation link. And of course, in the process of activating their account, they'll verify that email address. Both account activations and password resets will use a pattern that we've seen before. So let's take a look at a table, get a sense of where we're going. Before, with regular login, we had a find by email and then used a password that was then compared to a password digest using the authenticate method. Then with remember me, we found by the ID, which was in the session, and then used the remember token essentially as a password, and then compared it to the remember digest, and we used an authenticated question mark method that we wrote. This right here is an example of a generalized authenticated method that we'll write in this lesson. Then we see in the case of the account activation and password reset that we'll also be finding by email the way we did with passwords, and then we'll compare the activation token or the reset token to the corresponding digest in the database. As before, these digests will be hashed using the bcrypt algorithm, thus rendering it essentially impossible to infer the tokens from the digests. As with sessions, we'll model account activations as a resource even though they won't actually be associated with an active record model. Instead, the activation status will be in the user model. We'll get started by making a topic branch for account activation. Now I should mention that account activation and password reset used to be a single lesson, but they've now been split in two. Most of this lesson uses the branch name account activation password reset, but this is the right branch name to be using here. But we do need a controller for it, so let's generate that. It's plural because it's a resource. And then I'm going to put the backslash here, which is just a continuation character. And then I am going to want to edit these things. These account activations, we're going to be changing their status from inactive to active. Ordinarily, you would do that with an update, but as we'll see, there's a limitation in browsers that we're going to have to issue a GET request to an edit rather than a patch to an update. So that means I'm going to want an edit action. And we'll actually end up redirecting at the end of the edit rather than rendering a page. And that means that the default generated test would actually fail. So I'm going to skip the test framework with this flag, no test framework. This is the kind of thing that with experience you'll learn which things you want to do at the command line here. It wouldn't have been a big deal if we hadn't added these, but this is convenient for our purposes here. To get a sense of where we're going, let me show you the kind of route we're going to use in the account activation email. Just get a place to type here. There's going to be a link like this, edit account activation URL. Now ordinarily this would be something like the account activation object. And you can recall we can do this, like this. Might do something like this. But in this case, the account activations won't be active record object, so we're going to give it something else. We're going to give it a token. And then there will actually be some other parameters. We don't have to worry about these details right now, but I just want to give you a sense of what the route's going to look like so that we can do this. We can define our route for account activations. It's going to be resources, account activations, and we're only going to need edit. Our next step is to associate an activation token with users. So let's take a look at what that code will look like. We might have a user, and then there will be an activation token attached to that user, and that will be paired with an activation digest in the database. So this will be a virtual attribute, but we do want to make some additions to the data model. Let's take a look at that. The last thing we added was the admin attribute in the last lesson. Now we're going to add the activation digest to go with the activation token, an activated boolean that will give us an activated question mark method, and then even though we won't actually be using it in this lesson or indeed in the tutorial, for future reference we're going to record when the user was activated. And like the created at and updated at columns, that will be a date time. Let's turn that into a migration. We're going to add activation to users. And there are three things. There's the activation digest right here, which is a string. There's activated, which is a boolean, so that'll let us do things like this. If user.activated question mark. And then the activated at date time. There's actually one thing I want to do here. You might be able to guess it if you think about it. So let's go to db migrate, see if this is it. Yeah, it's already been updated. Great. So this is the migration. There are three attributes being added to the users table. And as with this admin migration, we want to make a default. So in fact, it's the same default. Activated should be false by default. Users should start in an inactive state, and then we'll activate them when they click on the activation link in the email we'll send. Let's save that and run the migration. Let's think about what's going to be involved in activating users now. When a user signs up for the site, they start in an inactive state, but they'll be activated when they click on a link with the right activation token, in particular the token corresponding to an activation digest. So that means that new users need to have a digest associated with them. So let's take a look at the user model. Here we've got a before save callback. Remember that we downcase the email to standardize on lowercase email. In this case, instead of having a standard method fire before a user is saved, we want it to happen before they're created, just the first time. Updating the user through the account settings shouldn't require reactivation, but that would be the case if we used a before save callback. So as you might be able to guess, just linguistically, there is a callback that fires before an active record object is created. That's before create. Now we could give this before create callback a block, like here, but that's actually not the standard way to do it. This was just the easiest thing to do at the time. But we're more advanced now, so let me show you the way that it's usually done. The usual convention is to give what's called a method reference. This is similar to the filters, the before filters. So we're going to do before create activation digest, and then we'll put this in this private section here because we don't need this outside of the object. Remember, when doing assignment, we need self dot. The self dot activation token. We want to set the token, and we can just reuse this new token that we made for the remember me functionality. By the way, if this bothers you, think, well, where's this activation token? We'll take care of that in a second. There's a digest. And that's going to be the same thing we did before with user.digest. It's just the paralleling the code here. User.digest of remember token. You'll note that before, with the remember token, we used update attribute like this, right here. That won't work here though, because this is a new user that hasn't even been created yet. So there's nothing to update. So this line here is being created in memory, and then it will be saved automatically when the create goes through. So I mentioned before that there was this problem with the activation token. In fact, we can run our tests. Let's do this. Let's save this file. We can see we've got an error. Undefined method activation token, or activation token equals. This is the assignment right here that's failing. And the reason for that is because activation token is a virtual attribute. So we need an outer accessor, just like remember token. So we can just add that here. You can see we haven't even written any specific tests for account activation, but our test suite is still useful. There's something else I want to do while we're at it. Let's cut this here and paste it in later on. Use this method reference technique. So go down here. Now that we've added the data model, let's update the seed users and the fixtures users. So that's in seeds. Let's make these activated by default. Do activated at time.zone.now. This is a way to get the current time, taking into account the time zone. And then let's copy this here. And the fixtures are in users.yaml. And let's just make this activated true. And give it activated at. Time.zone.now. And then we can reset the database and rerun our seeds. All right, let's take a look at the console to get a sense of what happened there. quit out of it because we just rechanged all the database users. You can see if the user was activated, the first user, activated at. There we go. So what we're going to do is create new users in the sign up page, and they're going to be inactive by default. So like this. Right, this is right in here. So user.activated question mark is false. And then when they click on the activation link in their email, we'll change this to true. Like that. We're done now with the basic data modeling, so we're actually now ready to make the email that will let users activate their accounts. The way to do this in Rails is with what's called Action Mailer. So let me show you how that works. We're going to generate a mailer in the same way we've generated other things so far. In this case, the mailer is going to be related to users. We're going to use the same mailer both for the account activations and for the password resets. So let's make a user mailer. And then at the same time, we're going to create a couple of the equivalent of actions. These are the analog of actions. They're just methods, but they're going to be called account activation and password reset. We'll see the effects of this in a moment. Let's take a look at what that gave us. So we can go to app mailers, usermailer.rb. You can see we've got account activation and password reset. There's a default greeting, which is just hi, in an instance variable, and then there's a line that actually mails to a particular email address. We can see the emails themselves in the views here. There's views, user mailer. You can see here, this is account activation.html. You can see that this is an HTML email, and then this is account activation.text, T-E-X-T. So this is a plain text version, and this is an HTML version. Let's set up the mailer here. So up here you can see there's a default from email address, so I'm going to change this to no reply. This is a quick insert showing a difference in Rails 4.2. In 4.2, this default from is no longer in the user mailer. Instead, there's a dedicated application mailer. So let me pull that in here. I've already made this change. So let's pull it in, and we can see here. So now we've got user mailer inherits from application mailer. Before it was action mailer base. So now it's application mailer, and that mailer is right here. So there's a default from here. So you should change that right here rather than editing the user mailer. You should edit the application mailer. And meanwhile, there are these mailer layouts. You can look at app, views, layouts, and you can see the mailer just has some HTML structure, and for the HTML mailer, and then the text mailer is just a yield. So this is similar to this, to the application .html.erb right here. So this yield is basically the same thing. Just inserts the contents right here. And then instead of a greeting, I'm going to create a user. So we're going to need a user in these templates here, these views, because the activation URL will need an activation token, and that's going to be on a user object. So @user is equal to a given user, so that's actually going to be a parameter to the account activation mailer. And we want to mail to the user's email address. And we can actually put a subject line in here too. There we go. Now let's take a look at the kind of URL we want to send. In here, we're going to do something like this. Actually, let's do the plain text first. It's a little easier. Let's do hi. We can treat this just like a regular view. We can have embedded Ruby here @user.name. And then we can give them a greeting. So this will give them some instructions, and then right here we need a link. So we can use the link to helper in here. Let's link to the word activate. And then we need to figure out what's the URL here. This is the challenge. So recall that if you do something like this, you end up with the URL like this. Actually, I can just do it like this here. This is example.com/users/1/edit. Right, so this is the ID here that comes from @user. So in this case, we're going to do this. We're going to do edit account activation URL, and we're going to give it, I mentioned this before briefly, we're going to give it the activation token. And so if we look at the user model, a newly created user has an activation token right here. So that's going to be like this, @user.activation token. And then we also want to have some other information in this URL. Remember from the table, we're going to find the user by email. We could use the ID, and in fact we are exposing the IDs like this here in the URLs of the application. But in principle, we might want to obfuscate that at some point, say if we wanted to hide how many users there were on the site. So it's a good idea to use something other than the ID. So we're going to use the email. And that means we need to put the email in this URL. Let's just recall what these tokens look like. Go here. These are base 64 strings. So this is the kind of thing that would show up in the URL. We would have a URL of the form example.com/account activations / and then the analog of this 1, which is in this case just the token. It's going to be like this, /edit. But then we also want this email in the URL so that we can pass it back to the application. And so the way that works in a URL is that you have a query parameter after a question mark. So you do like this, question mark, and then the key value pairs, email equals foo, say foo. So ordinarily you would think add example.com like this. But in fact, this @ sign in a URL has to be escaped out, and there's a special character code for that. That's %40. And Rails will do that for us automatically if we write something like this. Oh, and I realized I actually did something wrong here. This link to, this is HTML, so this is going to put in an anchor tag. This will be fine to put inside this here. Do this here. So this is the HTML mail, and then this will be the same URL in here. So this will be the actual URL. What we want is embedded Ruby with the link itself, so it's just going to be this here that we built up. Copy that, and it's going to be edit account activation URL with the token and then the email address. And then we want that here. As well. And let's put it in H1 here, sample app. We can also reuse this here, but except this time in the paragraph tag. Okay, let's save these and see the effects of that. In order to see these emails in a development environment, we have to update development. That's in config environments development. So let's look at that here. Config environments development. So this section here, we're going to configure the action mailer. Let's configure it to raise delivery errors if it can't deliver anything for any reason. And then we need to say the delivery method is test. We don't actually want to send emails here in development. We'll see that they show up in the log though. And then let's give it a host. This is just a local variable. The config is the next line I'll show you. We have to tell the system what the host is for the emails. So I'm just going to create a local variable called host. And in the tutorial it says example.com, but it should be what your actual URL is. So in this case, look at the example application, it should be this. Whatever this is for you. So it'll differ for you, but that's what it is for me. If you're running locally, this should just be localhost 3000, probably. Now this is all pretty abstract, so it would be really nice to be able to preview these emails. And in fact, Rails has this. Let's take a look at our test directory here. Test mailers, there are actually previews generated. So here's our user mailer preview. You can see it says preview this email at localhost 3000 / other stuff. So this is localhost 3000. In this case, I'm on the Cloud IDE, so I have to replace that. But this is great, the idea that we can preview these emails. In fact, let's go to that URL. You see that we get an error because in here it's calling user.mailer.account activation, but in fact our account activation requires that we give it, where is it here? Requires that we give it a parameter, which is the user. So over here we can just change this up and put in a user, but of course that means we need to define a user. So let's just pull out the first user from the development database. Save that. This won't work. See if you can guess why this won't work. If you look at the mailer, something's not going to work here. We just pulled the user out of the database and refresh it. This is pretty tricky. You can see that there's a route problem, having a problem generating the route from this named route, the edit account activation URL, which might make you think that there's a problem in the routes file, but the routes file is correct. Right, we've got our resources account activations only edit. So if we drill down a little more though, we can see that the problem is that we're missing a required key, which is ID, and the ID is nil. So that ID is the analog of this this /1, this /user/1. So what's happening here is that the activation token is missing. This thing here, this ID, is missing. And the reason for that is because here in the mailer, you can pick either of the mailers, we need an activation token here, but remember this is a virtual attribute. So when we pull the user out of the database, it doesn't actually have an activation token. Now that won't be a problem when we're using this for real because it will only be used for new users, and because of this callback here, every new user will have an activation token. But in this case, we have to give this user an activation token. We'll consider it equal to just the new token. Doesn't matter what it is, really. So this looks promising. This might actually work. Let's take a look. Nope. Oh, so I think the problem here is that I need to restart the server. It says missing host to link to. Please provide the host parameter, but we just did that here. Right, that's what this is. So it's probably just an issue of needing to restart the local server or the development server. All right, let's see if that worked. And look at that. This is the HTML mail from here. Look at this. This is the text mail. So this is the HTML mail. You can see that the H1 worked, and we've got this link here. You can copy it. Take a look at what that link gave us. So it's exactly the form we were hoping for. It's the domain, and then account activations, then the token, and then edit !email equals example, in this case at railstutorial.org. You can also look at the text version, view as plain text. So at this point we still haven't sent any email, but we're starting to believe this is really promising. We actually have working email here, these previews. Now that it's working, let's write a quick test. It's not as hard as it sounds, actually, because there's a nice generated test for us. Let's take a look. It's in, probably guess, it's in test, mailers, user mailer test. So you can see it's got a bunch of assertions pre-written for us. Of course, we've seen the assert equal assertion before, but there's a new one, assert match. What this does is a regular expression match. So this will check to see that the string hi appears somewhere in the encoded version of the mail. You can also do something like this. You can actually do a regular expression search. It's a very powerful method for doing assertions on content. We can save this and see if it passes. I suspect not. You can see we got the same error that we had in the preview. There's an argument error, wrong number of arguments on line 9, which is right. Actually, what? No, it's line 9 of the user mailer, so it's line 6 of the user mailer test right here. So that's this. That's kind of strange. I'm not sure why it's saying line 6, because the problem is that we're not giving this a user. So we need to do this. And then we can pull a user out of the fixtures. But just as we did over here, we actually have to give it an activation token, because this fixture user does not have an activation token by default. That's a virtual attribute that only happens when you create a user. So we can do user.activationToken. And then what do we want here? Well, this first assertion is right. Account activation is the subject. Let's take a look at that. Where's the mailer? Right, so account activation is the subject. The to mail should be the user's email address. From should be no reply at example.com. Comes from here. And then let's put in a couple of other matches here. We want assert match. Well, we want the token to appear, right? In the email. That's like this. We want the token to appear somewhere in the email. You can actually look here. So we can see here that the token is in the email. So let's test for that. Oh, and what else do we want? Actually, let's just move this over here too. We've got a greeting, so let's check for the name. User.name, and then same thing. So we've got the name, the activation token, so it's here. And we also want to verify that the email is there, so let's do that. Let's see if that works. We've got a failure here from the password reset test. We don't actually even need that yet, so I'm just going to get rid of it for now. But the other thing that went wrong, let's take a look at it. We've got an error here that says it's missing host to link to. So remember what we did in the development config section. We need to do a similar thing in test.rb. So this is in development.rb. It's config environments development.rb. So let's just look at test.rb. The same thing. Oops, here it is. Copy these. These can go anywhere in here, so let's just put it down here. And instead of the host being that, we can just make it example.com. Save that, and actually I'm not sure if this gets reloaded automatically. Let's find out. Go here and save this. Alright, the error has gone away, but now there's a failure. Let's take a look at it. The problem is that the email is not matching. And indeed, that's not surprising. You can see it's looking for michael@example.com, but remember that this thing is escaped out. It's got this %40. So this is the sort of thing where you just go to Google and you type something like Ruby Rails escape URL, and you find out that there are two main ways to do it. There's something called URI encode and CGI escape, and you try them both, and then one of them works. So let me show you how that goes here. You do CGI escape this thing. This is old school. CGI is Common Gateway Interface. Dates back to the early days of the web. Save that, see if that works. Great, now we're green. So this is a nice test here, this test of the account activation. We basically confirmed all of this stuff that we looked at in the preview. And now we're ready to add this mailer to the user sign-up process. So let's look at that. Actually, I'm going to save this and let me just rerun the full test suite. All right, our test suite is green. Let's take a look at the user's controller. What we want to do here is send this email when a user is created. So that's here in the create action. This is user sign up. And it should go in here. If at user.save. Now instead of logging the user in, we're actually going to get rid of this. And we're going to send the email. That's user mailer. Take a look at our test here. It's user mailer.account activation of user. So that's that. In this case, it's an @user, so let's do that. So this loads up the mailer, and then we want to actually deliver it. And the method for doing that is deliver now. And then instead of a flash success saying welcome to the sample app, let's give some info. We'll see this is going to give us a different color from the green success box. And let's say, please check your email to activate your account. And instead of redirecting to the profile URL, let's redirect to the root URL. So we can save that. You can see that the test suite is now broken. It's not all that surprising. We've changed the behavior quite a bit. Let's take a look at what's breaking. It's the user's sign-up test. Line 24. Right, so this is the test for valid sign-up information. The behavior of the application has changed. So after doing this post via redirect, we do still want this to happen, right? And that's still passing. But instead of asserting the user's show template, we're going to want to do something else. And also the user won't be logged in. So we're going to fix that up later in this lesson, but for now I'm just going to comment these out to get the test suite passing. Alright, so our test suite is passing for now. Let's take a look at what actually happens if we try to sign up as a new user. Alright, let's sign up now. I'll just use my name and email address, create my account, and you can see here's the flash message. Now it's a blue box instead of a green one. Please check your email to activate your account. Now, of course, we're not actually sending this email yet, but it does show up in the log, so let's look at that. Here it is. Here's the email. It's right here. Oh, in fact, that's just part of it. Here it is. Here's the whole thing. So that is the email that's going to get sent out when we're doing this for real. And you can see that it's got both the text version and the HTML version. So this is great, but of course this link doesn't yet work. You can paste it in, see what happens. Alright, you can see that there was a generated template. This is because we added edit to the Rails generate controller for account activations. So let's go here. And let's go to the account activations controller. Here it is. Oh, you know, I've realized we actually didn't want to put edit on the command line. It's nice because it gave us the edit action here, but it also created a template, which we don't want, right? We're actually not going to use this template, this edit template. And in fact, that probably means we didn't need that no test framework flag. So I'm actually going to kill this thing. Let's just destroy it. This is a useful exercise. Rails destroy controller. And then we can generate it. Let's see what that did. Let's go to the tests. So test, controllers. Good, so it does not have any tests in here. That's great. When we added edit there to this command line, by virtue of adding edit, it generates tests, which we don't want, but because we didn't generate it here, it's not going to affect us because there are no tests. Alright, so now let's open it up again. Now we do have to put in this edit by hand, but that's easy enough. All right, so this is what's going to handle the links like this here. This link. This is going to be routed to the edit action. Of course, now if we refresh this, it'll give us something different. I knew I was surprised that there was a template there. Right, this is what we were looking for. So this is the kind of error that I would have expected. So now that we've redone the controller, this is what you will get. And so let's think about what's going to be involved here in the edit action. So remember our table. We're going to find by email, and then we're going to authenticate the user based on the activation token. So we're going to do something like this. Find by email. It'll be in the params, as we'll see. That's from this here. That's what this gives us, this key value pair. And then we're going to say something like if the user exists and user.authenticated based on the activation token and the params of, well, that's this here. This is params of ID. Something like this. This is just a sketch. Else, this shouldn't happen too often, but then we'll just we'll handle an invalid activation link. Let's compare this to logging in. This is in the sessions controller. You can see we've got the same kind of thing. We're finding by email based on something in the params, and then if user and user.authenticated. So this is authenticate, but now we're using the authenticated question mark method that we wrote here for the remember token. But if you look at this, it says authenticated of remember token, and here we've got a symbol activation and then the actual token. So we're going to have to change the user model here. We're going to have to change authenticated to account for this use here. So this will not work right now, but I just want to give you a sketch of where we're going. Let's take another look at the authenticated question mark method to see where we are. Right, so in fact, let's move this over here. So this is the current usage, authenticated question mark of remember token, and what we want is authenticated question mark of a symbol, which will tell us the kind of token and then the token itself. So the first thing there is the attribute, and then we want it to be the token. So let's take a look at a console. I can show you how this works. This is going to be our first example of what's called metaprogramming, which is essentially programs that write programs. Ruby is really good at metaprogramming. In fact, much of the magic of Rails comes from its use of Ruby's metaprogramming facilities. So what we want here is a method that authenticates a different token against a different digest based on the value of this attribute. So let me show you how to build this up. Let's make an array here. Let's call a method on this array. Let's do a.length. There's a second way to do this. In the language of object-oriented programming, what this does is send the length method to the array A, and we can actually make that more explicit like this. We can call the send method directly, and then give it a symbol corresponding to the name of the method. So you can see that's the same thing, and in fact it works with a string as well. Let's look at this in the context of a user. We could do something like this. Let's take a look at the activation digest of that user. That's basically the kind of thing we expected, but let's take a look at this. We can do user.send, and then the symbol activation digest. It's the same thing. You can also do the string, activation digest. And so now I think you might see where I'm going with this. If we change this to a double-quoted string, we can do this. We can interpolate the symbol activation like that. So if we make this an attribute, we can just interpolate that variable into here. So going up here, we can see that we've got attribute token, and now instead of tying this to the remember digest, we can do this. And then we can return false if digest is nil. And here this is going to be new password called on digest, and then this is going to be token. And save that and see what happens to our tests. We've got an error here in the user test. Let's take a look at that. It's not that surprising. So what happened here is we've got an authenticated question mark method. And this is based on the old usage where it was a remember token by default, so we can just give it a symbol corresponding to the kind of token, and that should pass now. Great, and let's do this. See, we've got a couple errors. This second one here is in the sessions helper. I mean, this is one of those situations where it's just incredibly useful to have tests, just to be able to track down all these little places. So in this case, we've got a call to authenticated here. So we need to give this remember symbol. And that might be the only thing, I'm not sure. Yeah, there we go. So now our test suite is green. And now we're ready to return to the account activations controller. Let's take a look at this here. Now we can activate the user. And there's actually one thing I want to add here. Before I just did user and user.authenticated to match what we did in the sessions controller when we log people in. But in fact, we should only execute this activation if the user isn't already activated as well. So we should do this. There we go. Just double check that. That is the 81st column, so it just fits. So let's think about how we want to activate this user. Well, we want to update the activated attribute to be true, and we want to update the activated at timestamp to be the current time. So let's do that. User.update attribute. And activated at should be time.now. Oh, it's time.now, but we want this time zone. Time.zone.now. We could just show you what that does here. So let's just, oops, just want to put some spaces in here. All right, so this updates the attributes. And let's put in a flash message. We removed a success before, so now let's put it back. Let them know that their account is activated, and well, we want to redirect now to the profile page. We're basically just putting the stuff that used to be in the user's controller here. Remember, we used to have a flash success saying welcome to the sample app and a redirect to the profile page. Well, we're just basically putting that in here with a change of the message here. But we also want to log the user in. Remember, we did that over here too. In fact, we can just Control-Z this back. So we're essentially just taking the stuff that used to be here and putting it over here. Just redo this stuff here. And over here, let's handle the invalid link. This sounds like the kind of thing that should be a danger key. And just say invalid. Let's go to the root URL. Save that. I don't know, does that run any tests? Probably not. No. We'll write an integration test for this. But before we do that, let's take a look at this actual URL, this thing we did. So this might actually work. I'm curious. There we go, account activated. Check it out. So we can go to the console here. Let's find by email. Oh, and I want this here. There it is, activated true. Of course, right now the activation doesn't actually do anything, because what's the point if someone does this? Let's just have someone sign up. All right, so if I create the account, it'll do what it did before. So it says, please activate your account, check your email, but I can just log in. Right, so that's not at all what we want. We want to prevent that behavior, so the way to do that is to go into the sessions controller. This is where people log in. And so now we want to handle the case where the user isn't activated. So this stuff in here should happen only if the user is activated. Tab this over. Else, let's handle that. So let's put in a message. This is the kind of thing someone might do accidentally. So I actually don't want this to be a danger key. I'll do that in a second. This is the kind of thing, someone might just do this because they didn't realize it. So let's remind them. And let's put this in a warning. We'll see that gives us another color. And then redirect to the root URL. You can save that, and you can see what that does here. Let me log out. Try logging in again. And now I can do this. You can see that gives us this yellow flash here. And so we can go back to this here, look for the email. It's probably way back up here. Here it is. Copy this. And now the account's activated. Great. Now that we've got account activation working, we're going to add some integration tests to make sure that the functionality will continue to work and that we won't have regressions. There will be quite a few steps involved, so we're going to start by looking at some of the techniques that have been developed so far in some exercises to break up long tests. We'll actually be looking here at the user's login test, break this up into pieces, and then we'll apply those same techniques to write new tests for the account activation in this user signup test file. All right, so let's start with some of these techniques. Now you can see this is quite long. We've got, especially this one here, we've got a bunch of different steps all in this one test. Now this can work okay, but as tests get longer, it can be hard to figure out exactly what each section does. And so it can be convenient to chop it up into smaller pieces. But there are some barriers to doing this. So for example, if you look at this here, login with valid information followed by logout, we're posting to the login path with valid login information. Now everything in this test right here requires this setup. So the usual way of breaking things up into pieces would be to have different tests with this post in the setup. The problem is that that setup is inconsistent with this other test. Right? This is logging in with valid email but invalid password. So somehow we need to be able to break this test up into pieces and have a shared setup method that doesn't conflict with the other tests in the file. Now there's no totally standard way to do this with Minitest. There is a standard way to do this in a closely related way of testing called Minitest spec. Using Minitest spec, you can in fact create these common blocks of code for shared setup. But that's an additional dependency, and the syntax is also a little bit more complex. A similar consideration applies to RSpec, which is a separate testing framework. And in fact, earlier versions of this tutorial used RSpec. But again, the syntax is very heavy, and there are also compatibility issues potentially, especially as new versions of Rails come out. Sometimes RSpec trails a little behind, and using Minitest is a way of avoiding those complexities. The technique we'll use here applies regular vanilla Ruby classes, which is a really nice way of doing things because it doesn't add any extra syntax on top of regular Ruby. So let's see how it works. We'll start like this. We're going to say class users login. We're going to get rid of this test. We'll talk a little bit more later about why this is. And we're going to put this setup method in that just by itself. And then we're going to make a new class invalid password test, and we'll inherit from users login. So when this invalid password test class is created, it will automatically call this setup method. All right, so I haven't saved this yet. Let's just verify that our test suite is green. We're refactoring the test, so the entire suite should stay green the whole time. Well, it might go red a little bit, but we'll fix it up right away. All right, cool. So now inside of here, let's see, we've got the valid information. All right, let's do this here. Let's do another one here, class valid login. And also inherit here from users login. And we're going to create a new setup method here. Just copy this. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this test into pieces. So we want every one of these tests to have this shared post to the login path with the valid email and password. Let's do this here. And now note that there's a repetition here at user equals users Michael. We can eliminate that duplication by saying, you know what, we've already done that in the parent class in users login. Right here, we can arrange to run the setup method for the class we're inheriting from
by using a special method called super. It calls the setup method in the super class. So we've got that here. And then let's do this. Let's do, well, we did invalid. All right, so let's call this valid login test. And inherit from valid login. So what we're doing here is we're just putting the structure together with the classes and the different setup methods. These tests are still long, but we're factoring out the shared code, in this case, posting to the login path, and then we can go into these classes and break these tests up. We'll see how that works in just a moment. I don't like that little red here. Let's see what's going on here. Yeah, okay, there's a syntax error. Oh, I forgot this end here. There we go. All right, the editor caught it. That was nice. Okay, so should be green still. No, red. Okay. And I think what's going on here is this get login path. And we're already testing that up here. So let's get rid of this here. There we go. All right, let's keep going. We've got some tests here for logout. So let's break that into pieces. Right, we've got login with valid information followed by logout. All right, so we're going to do that later. Let's start refactoring these interior tests first. So we're actually going to have a whole separate section for logout. It's one of the nice advantages of this technique. All right, so let's make these shorter. So we're going to hoist this into here. Have a separate test for the login path. And this test is okay. It's a little long, but setting things up like this with the flash and then getting a different page and asserting that the flash disappears, that's the kind of thing that really just requires setting up a certain state in the application. So keeping it in one test, I think, makes sense. But in here, we can take care of the valid login and then factor out the logout stuff into a separate set of tests. All right, so let's test valid login. Do this here. So remember, this is happening after this post. So when we do the inheritance here, it automatically calls setup, which then calls super first. Super calls this here, sets up @user, and then it does post login path. So this should happen right after. Should be logged in and should be redirected to the profile page @user. And then we can say let's test redirect after login. Then that goes in here. We've done this configuration twice, once for development and once should be, and then we can say that's this stuff here. So it's the redirect and then the page structure. Should still be green. All right. And now we have at least a couple of different things here that all involve deleting logout path. So since they share that state, that suggests defining another one of these. I can just do this here. This is a valid login. So as before, we want to do super. So this is going to call this here. It's going to log in, and then it's going to log out. And that's this here. And let's have a class logout test. So that inherits from here, calls this setup, super goes up to here, then there's another super, so it goes up to here, defines that user, it goes back, posts to the login path, which logs in, and then it logs out. So we're testing this whole sequence. All right, it should still be green. Nope, except there's a syntax error. Right here. There we go. Okay, so let's break this thing into pieces. Could do test successful logout, and that's this here. We can do this thing here. This is testing redirect after logout. And then this thing here is testing logging out in the second window. So we can do this here. You'll note here that I use should. Some people like to use should for all of these. It's pretty hard to be completely consistent, but this is good enough. So let's delete logout path. Remember, we've already done that once here in the setup. So we're doing it a second time, and it should redirect to the root URL. Okay, let's see if that works. Should still be green. Excellent. And then we have this section here for remembering tests. So let's end this. So this is just user's login. We actually don't need any of this other stuff. We just need an @user. And that's because we're logging in directly using the login as method rather than posting as here. So all we need is an @user right here. So as long as we inherit from user's login, we'll have an @user. These should be in the same test because it does rely on the state. The point is that if we log in passing 0 here, it should delete the cookie. All right, so let's save this. It should be green. Great. So this now has a lot more structure, and it's a little easier to follow along with what's happening in the tests. By the way, you may wonder why we didn't just say user's login test like this, and then have it all in here like this, and then inherit down here like this. You can see that it went red. And the reason for that is that this here is being executed even down here. So valid login, user's login test. And this has to do with the way Minitest works. Minitest runs the code inside of any class that ends with the word test. So what's happening here is this inheritance is causing all of these tests to be run with a setup method where you've already logged in. But these tests require not being logged in. So we avoid this by creating base classes that don't have the word test in them. So the general rule of thumb is anything with a setup method should have a class name that doesn't end with test. All right, at this point, we're ready to start adding tests for our account activation. And as I mentioned before, we'll be using this test, the user signup test. We'll start by creating a class. And this class will have a setup method. And in the setup method, what we're going to do is clear action mailer base. So it turns out that inside of tests, delivering email actually will not be cleared by default. So this can cause other tests to fail, especially in the next lesson when we talk about password resets. So this turns out to be the code that you need. Inherit from here. Make sure this is still working. Good. All right, so let's start with this. Valid signup information with account activation. So we still want this here. And then let's also test that one email was delivered. So you might be able to guess that this action mailer base deliveries is the list of emails. So we cleared it up there as part of the setup, and so now the size of this should be equal to 1. All right, so we're actually going to handle this later on. I'm going to comment this out and put this at the bottom. This is what will happen after a successful activation. So let's just put that down for later use. And now let's handle the account activation itself. Now here, as it turns out, we're going to put everything in one class. So we actually can call this account activation test, but we should be ever alert that if we wanted to reuse this, in particular if we wanted to reuse the setup method, that we would have to do the same thing we did over here and define a separate class without the word test. Okay, so what does the setup method do? Well, what we want to do is test that the user isn't activated initially, and then after we do certain things, that the user is activated. So what that means is we need a user corresponding to this here. This is where we're creating a new user, so it's in here. So we're creating a user. You can see we have @user here. So we want to get access to this @user. Okay, so initially, let's just call super to make sure that the email is cleared, the email deliveries. And we want to have a valid signup, so let's just copy this. It's okay to copy here because here it's actually part of the test. We're actually testing this, and now that we know that it's working, we can put it in setup. And now in order to test this @user here, we can reach into the controller using a nice method called assigns. And the argument of assigns is a symbol that corresponds to an instance variable in the corresponding controller. This is actually not part of default Rails anymore. It got removed in Rails 5. But there's a Rails controller testing gem that's included in the gem file that gives us access to this. So it's important not to overuse this method, but this is one of the cases where it's really convenient. Well, initially, the user should not be activated. So let's do that. Let's say assert not activated. Okay. should be green. Right. So what are some of the other scenarios? So initially, the user isn't activated. So an unactivated user should not be able to log in. That's important to test. So that means if we try to log in as the user, it shouldn't work. Right. Now, in order to log in, you should need two things. You should need a valid activation token and a valid email. So let's make sure that if either one of those is wrong, that the user can't log in. The path for activating a user is edit account activation path. So let's get that. And let's give it an invalid token. Certainly the string invalid token is an invalid token. And then the email is @user.email. That's the valid email. Actually, you can just do this here. So now the user should not be logged in this case. Okay, and now let's just do the reverse. So this is the right token. But the wrong email. By the way, I don't know why I use double quotes here and single quotes here. It doesn't really matter. Just the way Ruby is. Okay, that should be the same thing. Should be passing. Great. And then we've got the third scenario, which is where we actually hit this page with a valid token and a valid email. And at that point, the user should be logged in. All right, so this should log in successfully. With valid activation token and email. So here we can just replace this with the real email. And this is where we get this stuff. This is exactly what should happen for a valid activation. All right, and that's it. Look at that. So we've got a nice broken up set of tests. We're testing all of the different scenarios, and this way we will quickly catch any regressions in our account activation code. As an application of this test, let's refactor a couple of things in our application code in order to make the design just a little bit more elegant. So in particular, we're going to move this functionality here, this sending an email, and the activation itself here. Right here, into the user model. So we're going to make a couple of utility methods in the user model like this. So we can actually even just write it out. We're going to say here, let's say @user.send activation email. This is essentially an abstraction layer. We're saying, okay, users know how to send their own activation emails. So let's go in here. So that should work. And then in here, let's just say users know how to activate themselves. So we'll just say user.activate here. Then in here, let's do this. So it's account activation. Let's say activates an account. Okay. All right, there are a couple of things here you might notice. We are now in the user model. So instead of user here, it should be self. Because inside of the user model, we don't have access to a variable called user, but we do have access to the user itself, which is like this. Self. And here, instead of @user, again, we don't have an @user inside the user model itself, but we can do this. So let's save all three of these. It's going to go red briefly. So this is going to go red. And let's see if this is green. All right. You may also recall from our discussion about modeling users that inside of the model, for a method like this, we can actually omit the self. So get rid of the self dot. Ruby knows automatically to use whatever the current instance is. In this case, a user instance. Should still be green. All right. So those details here, changing user to self here and then getting rid of it entirely, and changing @user to self down here when we hoisted this code into the user model, are exactly the kind of things that are really easy to lose track of, even in a simple refactoring. So if instead of self, we just copied and pasted, we did @user. Oh, this should work. Wait, why did that work? So what's happening here is that guard is configured by default just to run the user test. So we actually need to run all of them. Actually, we can just save over here. This is why it's important to run the whole test suite too. Yeah. So let's get rid of this here. And there we go. So now it's green. So that's exactly the kind of thing that would be really easy to omit accidentally, but the test suite catches it. Well, maybe not quite right away because of our configuration of guard, but very quickly. As soon as we run the full test suite, boom, it goes red. And that's it for the main account activation code. The only thing left is to get it working in production. At this point, both account activation and password reset are working, so there's only one thing left, which is to get the email sending to work in production. We're going to be using a service called SendGrid that allows you to send up to 200 emails a day for free. That'll be plenty for our purposes. There's an add-on at Heroku for SendGrid, so we can add it like this. Heroku add-ons add SendGrid, and this is the starter tier. Now I should mention that this will not work unless your Heroku account has been verified, but that's really easy. All you have to do is add a credit card to your Heroku account. That doesn't actually charge you, it just associates a credit card with your account. So once you've done that, you should be able to add on the SendGrid starter package. Okay, to get that to work, we're going to have to configure our production environment. Let's take a look. It's in config environments production.rb. This is the kind of configuration I generally recommend copying and pasting, so I'm going to follow my own advice and copy it from the Rails tutorial book. Let's just copy this here. And we've got this raised delivery errors. Actually, you know, something just occurred to me. I think there's something repeated. Yeah, let's get rid of this. This does no harm, but we don't need that. And then in here, This can go anywhere here, so let's just look at mail. Is there a place to have mail? Yeah. And you can see this section here, it says Your Heroku App. So that's, for me, Gentle Garden. Like this. gentlegarden.herokuapp.com. It's the host. Then that goes in here. We've done this configuration twice, once for development and once for test. It's like this right here. And then there are some settings for SMTP, which is the simple mail transfer protocol. And there are a couple of important lines here. There's a username and password, and this uses an env hash that lives on Heroku. This is a best practice for configuration files like this. You should never have a password exposed if you can at all avoid it. So what will happen here is, in this case, Heroku will automatically set these environment variables on the server. But we'll see in the next lesson how we can set them ourselves. In fact, we can find out what their values are. Let's do this. We can actually see what they are with Heroku config get. We'll actually do Heroku config set in the next lesson. It'll set our Amazon S3 credentials. So that's that, and then we can do password here too. So by putting them on Heroku and not putting them in our file, we arrange for it to be basically impossible for anyone to get any of these values unless they actually have access to our server. Can save that. With this configuration file, we're ready to make a commit and push up to Heroku. So let's do that. Let's rerun our test suite one more time before we deploy. All right, we're green, so let's deploy this thing. We've changed the data model, so let's run a migration. Let's Heroku run. All right, this should be working now. Let's check it out. Let's start with a new user. Create my account. That's good. So let me check my email. See if I have an activation link. Here it is. Account activation. Will this work? There it is, account activated. That's pretty awesome. Even I find it hard to believe this actually worked. Let's log out here. At this point, we're done with account activation, and we're ready to move on to the similar subject of password reset. It's a nice variation on a theme. Password reset is similar to account activation, so we'll be able to reuse a lot of the same ideas, but it's just different enough to pose a real challenge.